Welcome. I hope that you're joining in today and that you're going to be able to learn something. I've been praying for you and for us as we study Ecclesiastes together. It's a heavy book, and maybe you think to yourself, why something so heavy during the middle of something like a pandemic? And I guess I would just answer that's exactly why we need it. I think one of the gifts of passages of Scripture, really like the entirety of the book of Job, for instance, and Ecclesiastes, is that it helps us in times when we can't pretend everything's okay. So we've been studying Ecclesiastes. If you haven't gotten caught up, there's some videos that you could go back. We are 6 or 7 weeks in. I realized as well that I usually point up here because that's my left, and I thought the clicker thing was on the left, but I should probably watch these back. I think it's here, but you should be able to look if you're on the website. It's there. But nonetheless, thanks so much for joining in. We have a topic today that I think will be intriguing and interesting, and we'll get to it in a minute. But we have a little bit of a routine here because we've been separated so much during this. What we've really ended up doing now lately is we have tried to share something personal. I have a practice of keeping things in the office that can bring me joy or have some sort of meaning. I would encourage you to do the same. I think it's a good thing. So today, I'm going to show you this little guy, this little instrument, stringed instrument. You can actually tune it. Right now it's horrible. I don't even know if you can hear any of it. You can actually tune this thing to make it sound okay. This is meaningful to me, and I keep it in the office for a number of reasons. I got it probably at least 10 years ago now from my sister-in-law, my wife's youngest sister. She spent a couple of months in Swaziland, or close to that, in Africa, helping serving at an orphanage. And her and I used to play the guitar together. She learned, and I was playing a little bit as well. There's even some Christmases and things like that at my in-laws where we would play songs together, carols together for family and that kind of stuff. So one, it just is cool that it's a stringed instrument. It makes me think of those times that we had together. Two, it's just from a neat place, and I think it's a hand-carved, probably mainly for tourism. It's not like an actual instrument, but it's fun and functions that way. And then ultimately it reminds me of my sister-in-law, who's dear to me. It's been super kind, and she got me this. So there we are. Fun little instrument. I'll set this over here, and we're gonna jump in. I said last time that we're in the middle of the book of Ecclesiastes, which means that we're going to do something different than just studying it down verse by verse. There are portions of this book that are proverbial in nature. So much like the book of Proverbs, if you've ever done a study through Proverbs, you know that at a certain point you basically have to take topics, because if you try to say, what is the topic of, or what's the main lesson of Proverbs 15, you'll find that they jump around everywhere. And it's really through comparisons and a collection of sayings that we parse out the full wisdom of the book. And you have to look at the totality of what it says to get the full picture. Ecclesiastes is not all like that. In fact, I think the first 3-4 chapters lay out a pretty logical, consistent argument for the vanity of all things under the sun. And remember, the perspective of the Koheleth, of the preacher, the perspective here is that God exists, he is to be feared, but we do not have in view hope for a life after this life. His perspective is to bring forward, with as much clarity as possible, what hope does a person who looks for ultimate meaning here in this life, what hope do they have? And he ultimately comes to the conclusion, there's none. And I think that he's vexed by this, and he invites us to the same level of vexation. He finds that human beings have something in us that long for ultimate meaning, and yet we've been cursed to live in a place and in bodies where we can't find that meaning here. And if we pull that thread long enough, essentially it's going to bring us great joy because we ultimately find a Redeemer. In other words, Ecclesiastes is meant to stir in us the kind of longings that will be answered in the rest of Scripture. That's been my argument from the beginning. I believe that's faithful to the point of the writer. And so now here in the middle of the book, he's bringing up a series of topics. We have talked about work. We've talked about wealth. We've talked about injustice and suffering, and all of the ways that people try to contemplate these things, and then more than that, dive into them wholeheartedly, but find that they come up short. Today, we're going to come to one of the most obvious, one of the most clear examples that the quest to find meaning is short-circuited in this life. And in this case, not just internal satisfaction, not just internal desire to be fully satisfied with meaning here in this world through work or wealth or pleasure, but an external thing that is enforced upon us that ultimately brings everything to an end. That is, of course, the topic of death. Death. Death is going to get a proper treatment in Ecclesiastes, whether we like it or not. That's what Koheleth is going to say. And it's going to get a proper treatment in this book because whether we like it or not, death has a kind of final say, especially if you believe that this life is all that we have. Death gets the final laugh in that sense. And so it must be considered. A wise person does not ignore this fact. What happens beginning in the 7th chapter, really, he tackles it the most head on, the 7th chapter, though it's been hinted at previously a number of different places. You could create a verse list that starts really in the 2nd chapter and goes all the way through Ecclesiastes to talk about the meaninglessness, the vanity of the fact that the wise and the fool dies, the man and the beast dies, the rich and the poor dies. And it is here in the 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes that I'm going to read in a moment that shows us by comparison the value or the worth of death. That's what's going to be commended to us. So this is Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 1. I'm going to read down through the first 4 verses, and we'll pause to consider. The preacher, Solomon, tells us this: a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise, so verse 4 is an intriguing one, worth considering. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Mirth is a wonderful word that means an explosion of joy, a sort of exuberant, right? An exuberant, it's a sense that here's a party. And he says, here's the contrast. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. One thing I want to say at the outset to help us to understand, death, because this is a proverbial section of Proverbs, death is going to be compared to things. And it's through that comparison and contrast that we come to knowledge of a subject. In fact, chapter 7 itself has a number of these comparisons, and we could talk about them perhaps in later studies. The difference between praise and rebuke, for instance, they'll be set up side by side. And here, at the beginning, at the outset of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we have death compared to birth. And there's a striking saying here. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of birth. Now, he has not pulled any punches right from the outset. Solomon gives us something to contemplate and something to consider. This is a difficult saying. It sounds perhaps suicidal even. In the beginning of chapter 6 is even more direct in this case. It says that a stillborn is better than someone who has lived to understand a life of vanity. And what happens here is, like most good proverbial sayings, the joy or the value is not in the nuance. All of the excess, all of the exaggeration, all the leverage pressed in one direction to make sure that we fully explored these concepts. So I'm not going to argue that Ecclesiastes chapter 7 is all that should be said about death or about birth. It is not intended to be that. It is, however, intended to show us the potential of the human heart to ignore one of the greatest realities, in fact, I think the greatest challenge to meaning in this life, the fact of our death. And so when I said that this is about death, it is about death, but I want you to note from the start that it's really about death in contrast or in comparison to another word that I'll use that starts with D, that is to be avoided in excess. And that is this word, diversion. Diversion. It's really death in comparison to diversion that Solomon is going to say marks the heart of a wise person. There was a wonderful little book a number of years back called Amusing Ourselves to Death. The concept there, as it is here, the reason he says it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. He says the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, not the fools who are in the house of mirth. The comparison here is to recognize something in the human heart. Because we've been designed for ultimate meaning, and because death is such an obvious killer of that meaning, it's in a sense, it's the ultimate vanity, that no matter how hard you've worked or what you've invested your life in, it ultimately comes to an end. Blaise Pascal in in a book. It's a book, but it's really a collection of sayings called Pensies, his thoughts. Mentions that no matter how good the play is, your life is, that the way that it ends is an ultimate vanity and sadness. He says they put a little dirt over your head, and then eventually death has had its say. 100% of people die. And this fact is astounding. And what is mentioned here is that Solomon is getting to something. It's our quest for meaning. It's a love of self. It's our desire to be known and to have something lasting that makes us attempt something that ought to be and really should be seen as impossible. It makes us attempt by diversion, by feasting, by mirth, by diversion so many times, and so much of our life is spent ignoring this massive fact. And it is truly the fool who ignores the fact of death. It's been said that the benefit of death, the benefit of going to the house of mourning, and that's what Solomon argues, is that every funeral in that sense anticipates our own, or it should, for the person who is wise. I've heard it said as well that there is something about death that is so central. He says later that it's the heart of the wise. The heart of the wise gets roused by death. He says that this is the end of all mankind. The living will lay it to heart. In the Old Testament, the concept of a heart is a place of memory, a place of passion, a place of feeling, a place of desire. And what is being pressed forward here is that death in this life under the sun is so disturbing, so out of place. It so insists on the vanity of all that we think is grandiose and will last forever, that it should shock us. It should stir us. It should get down to the very soul of who we are. And a wise person will say, that's not so bad of a thing. So, one of the attempts, or one of the goals that we're going to have here, is to examine and to explore both these concepts. We're going to admit the temptation to diversion, and then we are going to embrace the wisdom of death. I have a little quote behind me, and I know that this whiteboard especially is not great. It's great for me to remember things, because I sit at my desk and I just turn around. It's not great, and I haven't used it much. It's not great for you, the viewer, to get what's up here. So I'm going to read this from that same little list of thoughts, that Pensies, Pascal, or however you would say it, right, has this to say. And I think it gets to the heart of Ecclesiastes chapter 7. He says this: as men are not able, they're not able to fight against death, misery, ignorance. And by fight against, I think he means get to the end of it, or push them off ultimately, or solve them as a problem. Pascal was a scientist, a mathematician. As men are not able to fight against death, misery, and ignorance, they have taken it into their heads. They've gotten the idea. They've taken it into their heads. In order to be happy, and Pascal is amazing on the concept of the pursuit of happiness as the heart of mankind. He says, in order to be happy, they've taken it into their heads not to think of them at all, not to think of death at all. This work, this book of Pensies by Pascal is amazing. Every time I say his name, I think I should have a better pronunciation of it, so I apologize if I'm butchering it or if I'm overly insecure about butchering it. Either way, the point in his work is a delicious, insightful examination of the human heart and why it is that we insist on being distracted and diverted so often. And he summarizes it by saying, because the alternative, dealing with the reality of life, dealing with the reality of this place. As a famous poet that once said, it turns out that humans cannot handle very much reality. It turns out that the reality of this life, the reality that it will end, the reality that we all die, is so disturbing and goes against the very core of our being, this idea that God placed eternity in our hearts, that we can scarcely bear to think of it. But the wise will not do such a thing. So the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge this thirst that we have for diversion, and I am at the head of the line. When I encounter difficulty, when I encounter tough things, when there are topics of sadness, when there's something that I know that I can't solve, I will very quickly rush to get lost in anything that I can. And I believe that for myself, if I'm really getting to a soul level, one of the greatest tests for me of how I'm doing, and if I'm struggling, if I'm actually embracing the grace that God has given me, is how much am I tempted to escape? And what that shows me is a couple of things. One, either life is very difficult right now, or two, perhaps I'm not embracing the moment that God is giving for me to grow in wisdom related to the most difficult aspects of life. How tempted am I to escape? And I would ask you the same question. One of the things that we must all examine in order to get to a place of wisdom, we must be able to take stock of and admit our diversions. Now, in life, I believe that people have a kind of hierarchy based on their own preferences or maybe on what's socially acceptable. And clearly, some diversions are more destructive than others. If you say my diversion is bank robbery or something, I mean, that's going to be a different thing than my diversion is gardening. So it is possible that if in the listing of your diversions, you may need to get greater help. But as a general rule, I want to put for now all diversion in the same category as an attempt to escape the deep and perhaps the troubling or dark realities of life. And so I would encourage you, what are your diversions? Think on these things. When you look back over a course of a month or over a couple of months or even years, where do you go when you don't want to contemplate difficult things? What is gathering and begging for more of your time than it ought to? What would someone say becomes a kind of refuge for you? And see, here's the interesting part. A diversion is an attempt for a refuge. We want to ignore the difficult and we go to be hidden away, to escape, to create a new life. Scripture, of course, remember, Ecclesiastes drives us to the rest of Scripture, is going to show us we do in fact need a diversion. We need an escape. We need a refuge, which is why God offers to be our refuge. We oftentimes, however, ignore this offer that he has and we seek it in a million different ways. So first thing we must do to become wise, this is what Solomon says, don't go to the house of feasting. You know why people go to the house of feasting? To ignore. There's a wonderful line in, I think it's Despicable Me 2, where he's pretending to be a princess or something, and they say basically like, why are you so big? And he says, because sometimes I eat my feelings. That's the concept. He's diverting. He wants some kind of pleasure. So I'd say first path to wisdom, according to this in reference to death, admit our diversions. One of those diversions might be that you ignore the fact of death altogether. And so, in order to solve this, what the book tells us is to embrace the wisdom of death. It's been said that death, more than anything else, can be a great teacher for us if we let it. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that I think death teaches us, according to Ecclesiastes, and I think from my own experience. First of all, I believe that death sobers us against potentially delusional feelings or ideas of grandiose, this idea that somehow what we do will last forever. Death is the ultimate sobering that there will be an end of all things. And many of us, in order to temper our diversions, in order to push down and tamp down the passions that rage within us, or this kind of selfishness, death can be a wonderful teacher if we let it speak, if we stop and listen, if we let the reality of our death seep in. It will teach us how to live a more balanced whole life. We need sobering more than we're willing often to admit. And it is death itself that will sober us. That's why he says the living will lay it to heart. I think the first thing that means, lay it to heart, means pause and think about the oddness, the certainty of death. It will come. Secondarily, I believe that contemplation of death, if you force yourself, he says that it's the wise heart who's in the house of mourning. In other words, if we don't avoid funerals but go there, if we don't avoid the sick but run there, then we will have a proper balancing. It's going to help us. It's going to help us in those times when we're tempted to divert. If we allow death to beckon us instead, it's going to keep us from lives of excess and of complete and utter ignorance, of living in a Pollyannish world that makes it impossible for us to speak to our own souls, let alone the souls of others. It is oftentimes the people who have contemplated death the most who have been to the bottom of mourning, who have walked with people through suffering and seen life's end. It is those people who often have a kind of strength of spirit and soul that allows them to be a blessing to others. The living lay it to heart, not only to sober us personally, but I believe that death becomes an ultimate teacher, a guide to show us how to be a blessing to others. And finally, I've already mentioned it, but we ought to be willing to go to a place of death, to go to a funeral, because this will bring us to the most obvious longing that we have, rather than the fake diversions we create. What we ultimately are supposed to receive from death is a longing for true escape, for a life that will not end. In other words, our thirst in this life will lead us to want, to long for, to delight in living water that Jesus offers. There's a reason that the New Testament is so honest about death all the time. And it is through the lens of the New Testament that we ultimately see the fulfillment of the teaching that death can offer us here in Ecclesiastes 7. That is, Paul himself rings of the wisdom of Solomon, but not in a hopeless way, which is the tone, the vanity of Ecclesiastes, but through Christ. Solomon has seen the problem. Through Christ, Paul has seen the problem, but also sees the solution. Paul says it is better to die, for to die is gain, to be with Christ. A Christian can truly see that this life is not all that we have. The end of this life is just the beginning of an illustrious, long, better existence. There's a story in early Rome of a pandemic, a plague, which may seem commonplace to you. I mentioned this plague early, I think, in the pandemic on one of us Sunday mornings. And the stories of the way people responded, there's a significant one. A significant Roman doctor of the day saw this coming, and he famously fled the city. He left at a time when seemingly doctors would be most in demand. But he so feared for his own life that he left. And there in the trenches, it was Christians who gave the most support, the most care, who were the ones that gathered the dying and the dead from the streets and brought them to proper burial and to proper care. It is often said, and I believe accurately, that it was the response of Christians to episodes of death like this that gave rise to the respect and the esteem of this belief system, of this hope. In other words, how could you face the reality of death but not be hopeless? And when we get to this place, when Christ has assured us of our life so deeply that we can minister to others in the face of death and not fear it, then we have truly, truly entered a new life. However, if we've not reckoned with these things, if we fear death, if we do not have a hope for a resurrection and a newness of life, then we will be like Solomon. Under the sun, death is the ultimate meaninglessness. The Apostle Paul acknowledges this in 1 Corinthians 15. He tells us that if the resurrection of Jesus is not true, if it's not fact, if life itself had not come in from above under the sun, from another place, we are most of all to be pitied. Why pitied? Because all of our faith, all of our life, all of our work would be vanity, which is what Solomon sees here. He realizes that if all we have is here under the sun, then death is the ultimate killer of meaning, and it must be reckoned with. Christians, though, have a greater hope than this. We are able to be those who are wise. We are able to be those who acknowledge the reality of death, but understand that it is simply the beginning. It is simply the moment when we begin to serve others by our understanding of life that is more than life. We live beyond death. Thanks for tuning in. So glad that you've been a part of this. We're going to continue to study the book in the weeks to come. Thanks.